Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 17, which will be on Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. The post-1973 energy crisis. Why was there a crisis, and what was its effect on the United States? Well, in 1973, the United States took the side of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was sucker punched by the Egyptians and the Syrians. And the punishment was a 6-month oil embargo, and later the OPEC cartel, the oil-producing countries cartel, quadrupled the price of oil overnight. And what happened here led to inflation, led to unemployment, and coupled together, this is called stagflation. And this energy crisis is going to endure through the Nixon years into the Ford years and into the Jimmy Carter years. Jimmy Carter's problems during his term, which led to his defeat and a win in 1980 by Ronald Reagan. Well, a whole bunch of things here. There's sort of the pendulum has swung away from the Great Society, and you have a dissatisfaction with the size of government, with bureaucratic government, with government taxing and spending money on welfare, giving it from those who work to those who shirk. You have the humiliation abroad, Vietnam, followed by the Iranian Revolution, where the Ayatollah's students took over our embassy and took our diplomats hostage. You have the giving away of the Panama Canal by Jimmy Carter. You have the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. You have these economic problems of high inflation, of high unemployment, of high interest rates trying to snuff out the inflation. On top of this, you have the high oil prices. And then you have some moral problems, especially seen by those on the evangelical Christian right, and that would be problems of abortion and increasing promiscuity, problems of crime, problems of a growing homosexual rights movement, the getting rid of prayer in public schools. So collectively, these moral problems, these overseas foreign policy problems, these economic problems, this distaste for big government is going to lead to the undoing of Jimmy Carter. And the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter is going to be based on human rights. And we're not going to support dictators any longer. We're not going to support those who torture. Now, we're inconsistent. We continue to support the South Koreans, and we continue to support the Iranians, and so forth. But there is going to be a turn against certain dictators, such as in Argentina, waging the dirty war down there. And there's going to be the perception that Carter is perhaps naive in a world where you have to play dirty sometimes and support a bad guy to stop a worse guy, those being those who are dictators against those who are authoritarian dictators against those who are totalitarian communist regimes. The Iranian hostage crisis, remember in 1979, over 50 American hostages are being held by the students who stormed the American embassy, and they're held for 444 days, and these students are in support of this radical Muslim government, fundamentalist government of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they're especially angered the Shah, who has violated all sorts of Muslim moral strictures, has had a police force which tortured, and the guy's corrupt, and he comes to the United States for cancer surgery, and they're angry that we're giving him sanctuary, and they want him back, and we don't give him back. Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California case in 1979 while Carter was president. This is an affirmative action case. This white guy who is, he's an engineer, I believe, and he wants to get into medical school, and he's got good grades, and he doesn't get in, and he finds out that his scores, that his grades are higher than the African-American applicants, and he sues. He says he's been discriminated against unjustly based upon his race. And the Supreme Court is going to sort of divide the affirmative action, anti-affirmative action arguments in half. They're going to strike down quotas based on race, but they're going to say that you can consider race in making decisions for entry into a university. The 3 Mile Island situation is a near nuclear meltdown at a power plant, 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, when a cooler reactor core is partially drained and some radioactive gases are vented from the reactor. And this is going to give energy, is going to give some movement to the anti-nuke movement, which is not just going to be against nuclear weapons, but against domestic nuclear power, which there was some support for. Remember, there is this energy crisis, there's this oil shortage, and there's this push for alternate types of energy, nuclear being one of them. You should be familiar with Love Canal. This is also under the Carter presidency, and it's discovered that a neighborhood in Niagara Falls has been built on top of a toxic waste site, and there's off-the-charts cancers for the people living in this neighborhood. What this is going to lead to is what's called the creation of the Superfund. And the Superfund is the nickname for a larger name of legislation, which is going to give billions of dollars to clean up toxic landfills, areas especially near where humans are living, such as Niagara Falls, next to Love Canal. Reaganomics is this idea that if you cut taxes on the rich, wealth will move from the top down. This is also called supply-side economics. It's also called trickle-down economics. And the thinking here is that when you cut taxes on the wealthy, when you cut taxes on the rich, they are going to invest in new businesses. They are going to create jobs. And this is going to be beneficial because it's going to provide greater employment. And I heard it once said, and it's an interesting statement, no poor person has ever hired me. And I think about all the jobs I've had, somebody richer than me gave me the job. So that's the thinking of Reaganomics, that you want to favor especially small businesses, but businesses in general. Federalism, you should be familiar with this term. This is one going back from our Unit 3 on the creation of the Constitution. This is the idea that the states haven't given up their sovereignty, that they share power with the national government. And what's going to happen is under Nixon and under Reagan, there's going to be this idea that power should devolve, that power should go back to the states. And remember, under Nixon, you have this idea of revenue sharing, where some of the money that comes to the federal government from the states will go back, and the states will get to decide whether they want to spend it on Medicaid, or whether they want to spend it on building roads, or whether they want to spend it on education. Let the states decide how best to spend this money. And why are there deficits under Ronald Reagan? Well, Ronald Reagan slashes taxes and increases spending, which basically is going to lead to a soaring deficit. And he's also going to cut the tax rates. The top rate is going to go down. So he cuts the rates, he cuts the overall taxes, but he cuts military spending. And the reality is, even though he is against liberalism, he's against welfare, he's against government spending, there are some cuts. But the big picture here, the entitlement spending, especially things like Social Security and Medicare, they continue to soar. So he's not as conservative as he seems in some regards here. The deficits go up, not just because of military spending. Why a growing gap between the wealthy and the rest of the country, beginning with Reagan? Well, you've got this government policy funding less money for education, cutting welfare. You have rising college costs, which are not being met by rising government grants. You have rising medical costs. You have the loss of high-paying jobs. And you have the beginning of this deindustrialization of the United States. As you have these high union jobs, as you have increased prices because of high oil costs, and petroleum goes into a lot of goods, you have what's happening is your choices to save money are to use robotics, to increase the number of people you need, to lay them off, to move your factories to non-union states, and ultimately to ship them overseas where labor is cheap. What's going to happen is this middle class that has a lot of union jobs in the 50s, where 1 out of 3 people are in unions. Now, I'm filming this 2018 here, something like 10% of Americans are in unions. So these high-paying jobs disappear with the factories. Moral majority, its issues. Moral majority is led by a Baptist minister out of Lynchburg, Virginia, named Jerry Falwell. He's going to work to unite mostly Christian evangelicals to vote for candidates who are conservative, who are pro-life, The goal here is to get candidates, especially for the president, see that will put conservative justices in the courts, and particularly on the Supreme Court, to turn back abortion rights, to allow for prayer in public schools. The evil empire speech, you should be familiar, Reagan puts a stop to this whole idea of détente, at least in his initial years here. Later he cozies up to Gorbachev. They seem to get along, and they sign some nuclear limitation agreements. But coming out of the gate here, Reagan calls the Soviets an evil empire. This is a phrase borrowed from Star Wars, and this sets the sort of the liberals all in a tizzy that he's inflaming things here. But Reagan's calling it like it is. Communism is this evil, brutal, cruel, tyrannical, oppressive system, and he's challenging the Soviets. And the Reagan doctrine, remember, the Reagan doctrine is not just containment, but it's roll back. Support the Contras as they're fighting the Marxist government in Nicaragua. Invade the island of Grenada, take it over, kick the Marxist guy out. The plan here is to push hard, lean hard, and to defeat communism. And part of this is an increased arms race. Reagan beefs up the American military. You've got the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars attempt to build missile-zapping satellites in outer space. And Reagan boldly calls communism evil, and he stands in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Remember that 63 speech by JFK where he says, Ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a Berliner, this idea that I'm a free man with the Berliners who are free, surrounded by a sea of tyranny. In front of the Brandenburg Gate, the president in Berlin says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So one other thought here, a place where we're supporting those who are fighting communism, we're supporting the Mujahideen, these are the freedom fighters, the Muslim freedom fighters in Afghanistan who are fighting the Russians, who are there for a decade. And it's American weapons that are shooting down Soviet helicopters and killing Soviet soldiers. And one of these guys very well may have been our man Osama bin Laden. The Iran-Contra affair. There's three controversies that are part of the Iran-Contra affair, which dogs the president at the end of his, in his second term. First of all, some rules that are all broken here. One is you're not supposed to sell arms to Iran. This is part of the punishment for taking our hostages. You can't sell weapons to the Contras. This is the Boland Amendment, which passes the Congress and says you can't give military supplies to overthrow this government in Central America, however odious it may be. And you can't give in the kidnappers. You can't pay ransoms to those who've taken American hostages. And in particular right now, there's a lot of hostages being held in Lebanon, which is being torn apart by civil war. And you've got this group, Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed Muslim fundamentalist terrorist group. And what happens here is we sell to the Iranians. We sell them weapons. Remember, their military, since we helped overthrow the government in the 50s, is largely an American-equipped military, even though they're anti-American at this time. And from 1980 to 88, the Iranians are fighting a war with Iraq. It's a Gulf War, which doesn't get as much press now in history books as our two wars do. But they're fighting this war with the Iraqis. And we take that. Why are we doing this? Well, because they're promising to help get our hostages back who are being held in Lebanon. So two things here which are no-nos. And then the money that's being made is being funneled to the Contras who are fighting the Marxist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The 1990-1991 Gulf War, this is under George H.W. Bush. This is the older Bush, not little Bush. And you should know the phrases Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And the scenario here, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. There's been this long argument over the border. In fact, even an argument that Kuwait really should be part of Iraq. The United States sends troops to Saudi to defend Saudi Arabia from the Iraqis. This is called Desert Shield. Once we cross over the border a few months later to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, that's called Desert Storm. And the ground action is over in 100 hours, in essentially 3 days. And it's a big win for George H.W. Bush. He organizes a multinational UN-backed attack on the Iraqis, which basically doesn't happen under his son later on in 2003. How does George H.W. differentiate himself from Reagan? Well, he tries to portray himself in the run-up to the election as being somebody who is more moderate, somebody, he has this phrase, to create, he's going to work at creating a kinder, gentler America. America that's not so severely conservative as Reagan's. But he has this speech, it's called Read My Lips. When they ask him if he's going to raise taxes, he says no, he's not going to raise taxes. But there's a recession that goes on under his term of office, and there is a sort of a soaring deficit. And Bush, to his credit, it's one of the reasons he perhaps loses the election to Clinton in '92, but he raises taxes. He does the big boy thing. He says if we're going to spend money, we should have some more money coming in. And Bush, that was an editorial, by the way, Bush is voted out. He's going to lose to Clinton in '92. Why did the Cold War come to an end when Bush was president? Well, there's a lot been written on this, a lot of theories here, sort of what exactly caused the Soviet Union to fall apart here. Gorbachev, amazingly, he's a hardcore communist, but he is sort of an idealist of sorts. He wants to breathe some life, some air into the communist system. He wants to provide more opportunity, more consumer goods for his people. He's going to allow what's called economic restructuring, some small business, some entrepreneurialism, and he's going to allow glasnost, which is basically freedom of speech, freedom of expression. There's going to be people printing and people assembling and people speaking. And he's ultimately going to allow free elections within the Communist Party and elections parties other than the Communist Party. And this, he takes the genie out of the bottle. It's not going back in. When you allow freedom, when you allow strikes, he gives in to the coal miners famously. What's going to happen here in Russia is the people are going to take freedom and they're going to run away with it. He is going to allow the Soviet republics to secede. When he's allowing this freedom of expression and speech and economics, you've got Lithuania as first, but later on the other, well, including Russia, which is really kind of amazing, all 15 republics pull out of the Soviet Union. They want their independence, even the Russians. And he also allows what's called the Outer Empire, and this would be places like East Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so forth. He allows them to basically throw off the yoke of communism. So as soon as as soon as Gorbachev and the communist government is not willing to imprison people and shoot them and jail them and invade them, should they be abroad, communism just implodes. It just vanishes. And good thing, a good thing. Clinton as a new Democrat, Clinton is going to win in positioning himself. He's watching these guys like Dukakis and he's watching McGovern sort of go down in flames. They're considered to be sort of anti-American, anti-business, anti-morality, high taxes, just sort of goofy in many ways. And Clinton is going to portray himself as a Democrat, maybe more like the Democrats back in the 50s, somebody who is strong on defense, somebody who's strong on law and order, somebody who is for social programs, but he's not for big business, but he's for strong, healthy businesses. So Clinton is going to win by taking a more, maybe a more moderate type of liberalism, and a central position, and he's got what's called triangulation. So as he triangulates, he's going to, like for abortion, he says abortion should be legal, it should be rare, it should be safe. He says on the matter of law and order, he is going to pass the Brady Bill, which is going to ban some semi-automatic weapons, and he's going to, there's going to be making a stricter background check. And these things, the NRA, the right people don't like it, but he's also going to put money for 100,000 cops to be on the street, and he's going to be for the death penalty as the governor of Arkansas. So he's this guy who's sort of straddling. He's taking these positions which are more moderate, more central, more business-friendly, and he presides over a healthy economy. And when he leaves office, he's going to have balanced the budget, and he's going to leave a surplus for George Bush, the little Bush, who is going to proceed to slash taxes and throw us back into massive deficit, increasing debt. But maybe that's another editorial comment. Maybe it isn't. All right, guys, that's the review sheet here. Know this stuff for the test. Good luck. Signing out.